The fire came first, orange light, bleeding up a mountainside sparks, eating through a door older than anyone left alive to remember it. A key, heavy rusted, older than the hand shaking around it. Somewhere in this story, a tower rises where no tower should exist, stone fused to steel across, bent sideways by 90 years of wind, standing over a family's silence, like a wound the mountain never let heal. Wide over the ridge, pines blur past a bus window, climbing into cloud. Closer now, gravel under boots, 5 miles of nothing, a road that simply stops. Closer still, a door with no handle, only a keyhole, and somewhere behind it, smoke already curling toward the rain. A man in an overcoat, far too clean for this mountain, steps out of a car that shouldn't be here. He is smiling. He has done this before. He was 18 years old when he inherited a key to a hole in the ground. No, that was someone else's story, someone else's grandson. This one belongs to a young woman named Marlo Whitfield, and it starts the way so many stories do with rain. The rain found her first, before the letter, before the lawyer's office, with its smell of dust and dead money. Before any of it, the rain found her cold and relentless, hammering down on a ridge in northern Oregon where no road reached anymore. Marlo Whitfield stood at the base of something that should not exist. It rose out of the mountainside like a wound the earth had never healed. Stone at the bottom, old stone, gray and pitted, stacked in a shape that looked like a lighthouse built by someone who had never seen the ocean. And above that, steel, rusted steel arches twisted into shapes like church windows. A cross bent sideways at the top, groaning every time the wind pushed through it. 27 meters of impossible. She didn't know that number yet. She would learn it later from a man in town who'd say it the way people say things they've repeated too many times to still believe. Right now, she only knew this, that her hands were shaking, that the key in her palm was heavier than any key had a right to be, and that somewhere behind her, a voice she'd trusted her whole short life had told her to be careful. Some histories, he'd said, are better left buried. She looked up at the tower and thought too late for that now. But we need to go back, because this moment, soaked, shaking, 18 years old, and standing at the edge of her whole family's silence, didn't start on this ridge. It started in a room that smelled like paper going quietly extinct. The lawyer's office was the kind of quiet that costs money. Marlo sat in a leather chair too big for her, in a donation bin dress too small for the occasion, and she thought about how strange it was. That grief had a waiting room. That inheritance came with an appointment time, the same way a dentist visit did, the same forced pleasantness at the front desk, the same magazines nobody read stacked on a side table like a joke. Nobody found funny. Her social worker had called it a formality. Carol always called things formalities. She'd said it about the group home placement 3 years ago. She'd said it about the court date that made Marlo officially no one's responsibility but her own. Carol had a talent for making the largest moments of a person's life sound like paperwork, and Marlo had never decided whether that was a mercy or a cruelty. 18 years old, one day past the birthday, nobody threw her a party, for there had been a store-bought cake with her name misspelled on it, Marlo instead of Marlo, and nobody had noticed until she pointed it out, and even then nobody had seemed to think it mattered enough to apologize for. And now this, a mahogany desk, a man named Walter Hensley, behind it glasses so thick they made his eyes look like they were underwater. He didn't offer condolences. He cleared his throat instead, dry, rustling, like paper folding in on itself. "Miss Whitfield," he said it like a verdict. "Your grandfather, Everett Whitfield. I represented him for over 30 years. Marlo said nothing. She'd learned that in the group homes. Silence didn't get you punished. Words did. Words got twisted, repeated back to you in meetings, used as evidence of an attitude problem. Silence was safer. Silence was armor she'd built one bad conversation at a time. His will is uncomplicated. Hensley opened a folder so thin it seemed insulting. After debts, after creditors, of which there were many, the remaining estate comes to $1,100. He let the number sit there, ugly, small. She felt nothing, because feeling something would have required knowing the man. And she hadn't. Not since she was 7 years old and he put her in a car with a stranger and never called again. 11 years of silence. And now $1,100 to close it out. Fair, she thought, about what I'm worth to him. There is one other item. Hensley's voice didn't change. That was the strange part. He reached into a drawer like he was pulling out something ordinary. A pen, a napkin. Instead, an envelope. Yellowed. Sealed with wax, the old kind, the kind that looks like a wound gone hard. Her name on the front. Spidery handwriting. Unfamiliar, and yet some small animal part of her recognized the shape of the letters, even if her conscious mind didn't. Marlowe Whitfield. She reached for it. Stopped. "What is it?" she asked. Not really a question. More like she needed to hear a human voice say something before her hands moved on their own. "A deed," Hensley said. 5 acres. Northern ridge near a town called Hollow's Bend. And a key to whatever's on the land. Worth anything but nothing. He said it fast, almost kind in the way people are kind when they're trying to protect you from hoping. Rocky, undeveloped. The county barely counts it as taxable. It's the one thing the creditors didn't want. Worthless, just like her, just like the $1,100. She should have left it. She knew that even then some small, hard, survival-shaped part of her knew that the smart move was to take the cash, find a cheap motel, and let the rest of it rot in a drawer somewhere. She had done the math 100 times in her head already sitting in that chair. $1,100 was 3 months of rent in the right city if she was careful. $1,100 was a bus ticket somewhere warm and a job application at a diner and a version of her life where Everett Whitfield stayed exactly what he'd been for 11 years. A closed door she never had to open. Except her hand had already closed around the envelope. Except something in her, some stubborn ember she'd thought long dead, wanted to know why. Why he sent her away. Why 11 years of nothing. Why a man she remembered as kind sawdust on his hands teaching her to skip stones on some river she could barely picture anymore. Why that man became a ghost. "Anything else?" she asked. Hensley paused. It was small, a half a second, but in that hush of a room it landed like something breaking. "He was a complicated man," Hensley said, softer now. "He wanted you to have this. Said it was the only thing of value he had left to give." Value. He'd leaned on that word, like it meant more than money. Marlowe stood. The chair sighed under her, relieved to let her go. At the door his voice caught her. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. "Be careful," Hensley said, and behind those thick lenses something moved that wasn't professional distance anymore. Something closer to fear. "Some histories are better left buried." She didn't answer. She just walked out into a city that had never once felt like it belonged to her, holding a piece of paper that might. The bus ride north took 14 hours. 14 hours to watch the city dissolve into suburbs. Suburbs fray into farmland. Farmland give way slowly, reluctantly to forests so dense it looked like the world had simply stopped trying to be tamed. She had $1,100 minus a bus ticket sitting in a new bank account she'd opened that morning with a teller who looked at her like she was too young to be doing this alone, which she was and also wasn't, because the state had decided the day before that she was old enough now, whether she felt it or not. She had a burner phone Carol had pressed into her hand at the last second, muttering something about staying safe, about calling if anything felt wrong, about how she wished there was more Carol could do, which Marlowe understood to mean there wasn't. And she had the envelope. She opened it somewhere around hour 6, the drone of the engine underneath her like a held breath. Inside, an iron key, heavy pitted with rust, the kind of object that felt like it remembered things. And a map. Hand-drawn. Old parchment, soft at the folds like it had been opened 1,000 times by someone who never once used it. A red circle. An X, and beneath it, in that same spidery hand. The door is on the north face of the ridge. The key fits only one lock. Trust what you find. Burn the rest. She read it 4 times. Because that's not an inheritance. That's a scavenger hunt built by a man who'd had decades to write a normal letter and chose instead to leave her a riddle. Who does that? Who leaves a child alone for 11 years and then from the grave expects her to go looking? And yet she couldn't stop staring at the map, at the coordinates, at the words, trust what you find. Like he already knew she'd doubt everything else about him. The bus climbed in elevation, the windows fogged with cold. Somewhere out there past the trees was a piece of land worth nothing and a lock worth everything. She thought about the man from her childhood. Flannel shirt, calloused hands, a voice that used to hum while he worked some old tune she couldn't name anymore. Just the shape of it, low and steady, the kind of humming that meant a person felt safe enough in their own skin to make a little noise. That man didn't square with secrets, with locks, with lawyers who flinched at the mention of him. Maybe she never knew him at all. Maybe none of it mattered anymore except it did. Because for the first time since she was 7 years old, she had a destination. Not a placement, not a case file, a destination. And that she realized staring out at the dark climbing hills was the most dangerous thing anyone had given her in over a decade. Hope. Hollow's Bend announced itself with a single blinking yellow light. A gas station. A diner with a neon sign missing half its letters, so that diner read DNR, which struck Marlowe in her exhausted state as a strange kind of honesty. A place that had stopped pretending to be whole a long time ago. A general store with a faded soda logo painted straight onto the brick, like the building itself had given up trying to look new sometime around 1965. The air hit her first, sharp, clean, pine and wet earth. A smell that reached backward into some part of her memory she thought she'd locked shut, and she felt her chest tighten before her mind even caught up to why. Childhood. This was the smell of childhood. She walked into the general store because she needed a flashlight, batteries, water, something that could pass for food. The man behind the counter was old, weathered, the kind of tired that comes from decades, not months. Passing through, he asked, ringing her up. Something like that. She hesitated, then because there was no one else to ask, she pulled out the map. I'm looking for a property on the Ridge Road, north side. He went still, not dramatic, not a gasp, just still. The way people go still when a name lands somewhere old. He put on his reading glasses, squinted at the map like it might change if he looked hard enough. That's the old Whitfield land, he said. Her stomach dropped. You know it. Everyone around here knows it. He looked up at her and something behind his eyes shifted, recognition maybe, or just the shape of a question he wasn't sure he should ask. Your kin, granddaughter. The word felt strange in her mouth, foreign, like a costume she hadn't earned the right to wear. He passed, she added when the silence stretched too long. The old man's face softened, just slightly. Sorry to hear it. Everett was a hard man. Kept to himself, something fierce these last years. But fair, always fair. He paused. You know what's out there? No. He looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding something. You'll see it before you reach the property line, he finally said. Can't miss it. Nobody around here's been able to miss it for 90 years. 90 years. That number would echo in her head the whole walk out. Ridge Road's about 5 miles, he said, pointing. Turns to gravel after 2, dirt after that. Property's at the end where the road just stops. He hesitated at the door as she left. Miss, he said, some folks around here call it the widow's silence. That tower out there. On account of nobody's seen a soul come or go from that ridge in 40 years. Not since Everett stopped letting anyone up there. Marlowe's hand tightened on the flashlight. He was alive all that time, though, she said, half a question. My grandfather, people saw him around town. Time to time. The old man's mouth twisted, considering. He'd come down for supplies. Talk to his lawyer on the phone from the store right there once a year maybe. But nobody went up that ridge with him. Not in 40 years. Whatever's up there, he kept it to himself the whole time he was keeping himself to himself. That was different. That made sense in the way none of the rest of it did. A man could live in the world at arm's length, take a phone call, buy his groceries, sign a legal document once a year, and still guard one single door on one single ridge, like it was the only thing standing between his family and something he never named. "What tower?" she said, but he'd already turned back to his register. Like he'd said more than he meant to. Like the words had slipped out before he could stop them. She stepped out into a sky already starting to bruise with rain clouds and thought a tower. Nobody said anything about a tower. The walk felt longer than 5 miles has any right to feel. Paved road gave way to gravel exactly like he said it would. Gravel crunched under her boots, the only sound besides wind moving through pines so tall they blotted out what was left of the daylight. She pulled her hood up, walked faster, because the clouds were pregnant with rain, and because, if she was honest, because the silence out here had teeth. By the time the dirt track dissolved into a wall of blackberry bramble and fern, a cold drizzle had already started. This was it, the end of the road, her grandfather's land, and it was exactly what Hensley had promised. Wild, overgrown, worthless on paper. No house, no cabin, no ruins even. Just 5 acres fighting for space under ancient Douglas firs that had probably been standing before anyone in her family was born. Despair came fast, came before she was ready for it. She'd spent her last hope chasing a ghost to a patch of forgotten dirt. An idiot, a kid playing at treasure hunter with a map some dead man scribbled to make himself feel better about abandoning her. She almost turned back. She almost walked the 5 miles to town and caught whatever bus left first going anywhere, going nowhere, it didn't matter which. Except, she looked at the map again, north face of the ridge. She found the ridge easily enough, a steep spine of rock running along the back edge of the property, dark with rain, slick with moss. She scrambled along its base, hands raw, clothes soaked through, cold clawing up through her boots like it wanted something from her. And then she rounded a stand of trees and the world tilted. Because there it was. The tower didn't announce itself slowly. It didn't build in her mind the way the old man's warnings had built. It simply existed all at once, impossibly rising straight up out of the ridge, like the mountain itself had grown something it wasn't supposed to. The bottom half was stone, gray granite weathered stacked in an octagonal shape like a lighthouse. But a lighthouse built for a coast that didn't exist here hundreds of miles from any ocean. Windows cut into the stone in narrow slits, dark watching. And above that steel, a different era entirely bolted or welded onto the stone like two buildings had been forced into a marriage neither wanted. Rust-red arches shaped like something out of an old cathedral church windows, without glass, just black open mouths where glass used to be. And at the very top, twisted by decades of wind, a steel cross bent sideways, groaning faintly every time the storm pushed through it. 20-some meters of it, vines choking one whole side thick as her wrist, climbing the stone like they'd been trying to pull the tower back into the earth for a century. The other side stood bare, exposed, rust weeping down the steel in long streaks that looked in the gray light like something bleeding. Marlowe stood frozen. Her mind tried 3 different explanations and rejected all of them. A lighthouse, except there was no water for 100 miles. A church, except no congregation would ever have built something this strange, this isolated, this deliberately hidden from any road. A watchtower, then. But for what? Guarding what? Out here in the middle of nowhere on 5 acres nobody wanted. Because none of it made sense. Because the man she remembered built birdhouses, fixed sagging porches, hummed old songs while he worked. That man did not build towers that looked like they belonged in someone's nightmare of a fairy tale gone wrong. Or he did, and she never knew him. Not really. Not even a little. The rain came harder, cold, relentless, running down her collar, soaking through to skin already numb. She thought of Hensley's warning. Be careful. Some histories are better left buried. She thought too late, because her feet were already moving toward it. Up close, the tower was worse. Better. She didn't have a word for what it was. The stone base looked older than anything she'd ever stood next to. Not decades old, generations old. Moss grew in the mortar lines like green veins mapping the passage of years she couldn't count. And higher up where the steel began, she could make out something that might have once been paint. A symbol faded almost past recognition near where the strange, bent cross met the arch below it. A circle, broken on one side. She didn't know what it meant. She'd learn later that it was older than her grandfather, older than his father, that it went back to a man named Josiah Whitfield who built the stone base almost 90 years ago as a private lighthouse for a coast he claimed in letters nobody quite believed was coming for all of them one day. Though what he meant by that, whether he spoke in metaphor or in something closer to prophecy, was a question nobody in 3 generations had ever answered. She didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she only knew this. Her hands were shaking so hard the flashlight kept slipping in her grip, and somewhere at the base of all that stone and rusted steel, there had to be a door. Because the map said so. Because the key in her pocket was too specific, too deliberate to fit anything less than exactly what it was made for. She circled the base, slower now, careful the rain turning the ground to something closer to mud with every step. And on the north face, exactly where the map promised, she found it. A door, heavy, recessed into the stone like it had been designed to be missed by anyone not specifically looking. Steel thick with rust that looked in the dying light like something dried and dark and old. No handle, just a keyhole. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat and stayed there. This was real. Whatever this was, whatever her grandfather had spent his whole quiet, complicated life protecting, it was real. And it had been standing here waiting for longer than she'd been alive. She pulled the iron key from her pocket. It felt heavier now than it had on the bus. Heavier than something made of metal should feel. Her hands trembled as she pressed it toward the lock. She thought in that last second before metal met metal of the old man's voice back in town. Nobody's seen a soul come or go from that ridge in 40 years. She didn't know yet exactly what 40 years of solitude could do to a man or what it could build. She was about to. The key slid in reluctant. Grinding. Metal fighting. Metal decades of rust screaming against decades of stillness. She had to lean her whole weight into it, both hands wrapped around the key, cold water running down her wrists. Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. And then a give, a shift somewhere deep inside the mechanism like something enormous, exhaling after holding its breath for 40 years. A groan rolled up from the base of the tower. Low, deep. The kind of sound that didn't belong to metal at all, but to something older. Something structural. Something that had been waiting. Crows scattered from the trees above screaming into the storm. Marlowe staggered back a step, heart slamming. Because that sound, that groan, it didn't feel like a door opening. It felt like something waking up. She stood there a long moment, rain soaking through every layer she owned. The flashlight beam trembling across rust-streaked steel, across stone, stacked by hands 3 generations removed from her own, across a door that had just impossibly given way. She thought about turning back. She thought about the $1,100 sitting untouched in a bank account somewhere, about a motel room, about a version of her life where she never came to Hollow's Bend at all, where the tower stayed a rumor in an old man's mouth and nothing more. And then she thought about her grandfather's handwriting. Trust what you find. Burn the rest. He'd known someone would eventually stand exactly where she was standing. He'd built this for her. Marlowe pressed her palm flat against the cold, wet steel of the door and pushed. It moved, slow, screaming on hinges that hadn't turned in 40 years. And beyond it, darkness. Waiting. Hers. She stepped forward into the dark, into whatever her family had spent 3 generations trying to bury. The door groaned shut behind her, and the storm outside went quiet all at once. The way a held breath goes quiet just before it's finally released. There was no light down here except what she carried, and for a moment she simply stood at the threshold, listening to her own pulse, before she made herself walk forward into whatever her grandfather had left behind. Stone steps descended in front of her, steep, disappearing into black. The air smelled like dust and cold iron, like a place that had been sealed against the world on purpose and had done its job well. "Go back," said some small, exhausted part of her. "Go back down that mountain and don't look at what he built." Except she couldn't, because the door had already grown shut behind her, sealing tight, and some primal animal part of her brain had already started counting how much air a sealed stone tower might actually hold. So she went down. The room at the bottom wasn't a room, it was a shelter. Concrete walls thick as a fortress. Steel beams overhead still solid despite everything. Shelves along one wall stacked with supplies that looked military-grade: canned rations, water jugs, gas masks folded into canvas bags, like something out of a war nobody told her about. Everything arranged with a precision that felt less like paranoia and more like devotion, the way a person organizes a space they intend to return to for the rest of their life. A cot in the corner, a single wool blanket folded with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who folded it the same way every single day for years. This wasn't a lighthouse. This was a bunker. Someone had built a bunker into the base of a 90-year-old tower and then spent decades preparing for something that never, as far as she knew, actually came. Her flashlight caught a green metal footlocker under the cot. And that was when her hands started shaking again. Because a bunker was strange. A bunker was frightening in the abstract, distant way that old family secrets are frightening. But a footlocker was personal. She knelt, fingers numb, fumbling with latches that gave way easier than she expected, like they'd been waiting for someone too. Inside, folded clothes, a flannel shirt, denim worn soft at the knees, the smell of cedar and something else, something that hit her before her mind could name it. Sawdust. Her breath caught, because that smell, that exact smell, it didn't belong to a stranger who abandoned her at 7 years old. It belonged to a man with calloused hands who used to hum while he worked, who taught her to skip stones on some river she'd almost forgotten existed. It was him. She pressed the flannel to her face without meaning to, and something cracked open in her chest that she'd kept locked since she was 7. Beneath the clothes, a photograph. A little girl on a man's shoulders, both of them grinning into the sun. She didn't remember the photo being taken, but she remembered the feeling, safe, weightless, like the whole world was smaller than his hands. At the very bottom of the trunk letters, a dozen at least tied together with twine, addressed to her in that same spidery hand. And on top, separated from the rest, a single word: first. She sat on the edge of the cot. The springs groaned under her weight, loud in a silence so total it felt like pressure against her ears. Her hands shook so hard she nearly tore the paper unfolding it. "My dearest Marlowe, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are a woman now. I hope the world has been kinder to you than I was. You have questions. You have every right to hate me for not answering them sooner. I am writing this so you might understand, even if you cannot forgive." Her eyes moved fast, faster than her mind could keep pace with. "I never wanted to send you away. You were the only good thing left in my life, but I had to make you disappear. Before you were born, I was not a good man. I partnered with someone in land dealings legitimate at first, buying parcels, development. Except the man I partnered with, Marcus Thorne, was never interested in legitimate. He used threats, fraud. He forced families off land that had been theirs for generations. When I found out how deep it went, I tried to walk away. I had proof, ledgers, documents that could have ended him. I threatened to go to the authorities." Marlowe's chest tightened, because she already knew somehow in the pit of her stomach exactly what came next. "That was my mistake. He made it clear what would happen if I spoke. He had people watching me, watching you. I remember the car outside your school, Marlowe. I remember telling you it was nothing. You believed me because you were 6 years old and I was your whole world. I was not protecting you by staying close. I was endangering you. As long as you were tied to me, you were leverage. The only way to keep you safe was to sever the tie completely." She stopped reading. Her hands were trembling too hard to hold the page steady. Because she remembered that car. She'd forgotten it, buried it somewhere under a decade of foster homes and case files, but she remembered it now, whole and sudden. A dark sedan outside her elementary school, her grandfather's face going pale. It wasn't nothing. It was never nothing. "I built this shelter years before as a precaution, a place to run if things went bad. But hiding you here with me was never enough. Because as long as Thorne believed you mattered to me, he would use you against me. So I made it look like I didn't care. I drove you to social services myself. I told you I couldn't take care of you anymore. I watched your face break, and I did not stop the car for 100 miles, because I knew if I stopped, I would turn around, and turning around would have gotten you killed. Every day since has been a version of that same drive. I have lived 11 years knowing my granddaughter believes I threw her away. I could not risk contact. Not a letter, not a phone call meant for you. Every year I called Walter Hensley just to know you existed somewhere in the world, safe, and every year that was the only mercy I allowed myself." The paper slipped from her hands. A single tear traced down through the dust on her cheek. Then another. And then it wasn't tears anymore. It was sobbing, deep, ugly, tearing sobs that echoed off concrete and steel, the sound of 11 years finally finding somewhere to go. She wasn't abandoned. She was protected in the cruelest, most selfless way a person could choose. She cried for the grandfather she'd hated for over a decade, for the 7-year-old girl who thought her whole world had ended in the back seat of a stranger's car, for every wall she'd built since then, brick by brick, because love had once looked exactly like being left behind. When the storm finally passed, she picked the letter back up, read the last lines with hands that had somehow gone steady. "This tower is yours now. There are supplies here. There is more if you want to look further. But you don't have to. You can take the money and walk away. Start over. Forget Thorne. Forget all of this. That is all I ever wanted for you. To be safe. To be free. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you every single day. Your grandfather, Everett." She sat there a long time in the dark, because the choice he'd laid out was almost too clean, too simple. Walk away and live free, honor his sacrifice by never looking back. Except she couldn't stop thinking about the man who'd taken her childhood and turned her grandfather into a ghost. Thorne, a name that had been nothing an hour ago and now sat in her chest like a stone. And she couldn't stop thinking either about the words further down and the older stone beneath this steel. Because the tower wasn't just his. The old man in town had said 90 years. Everett hadn't built the stone base. He'd only added to it, which meant there was more beneath her than one man's secret. She stood, flashlight sweeping the shelter one more time. And that's when she noticed it, a seam in the concrete floor near the back wall, almost invisible, forming a perfect square, older than the rest of the room. Sealed deliberately like someone wanted it forgotten entirely. She used the iron key to pry at the edge. It gave with a groan of stone against stone, and beneath it narrow steps descending further older, the concrete replaced by roughly cut rock the deeper she went. This wasn't Everett's shelter anymore. This was Josiah's, her great-grandfather, the one who built the lighthouse for a coast that didn't exist. The air down here was different, older. It smelled like something that had been waiting even longer than her grandfather's grief. At the bottom, a single locked chest, and beside it, a framed newspaper clipping so brittle it nearly crumbled at her touch. "Land dispute turns violent," the headline read. A date nearly 40 years before Marlowe was even born. Because history, she realized, standing frozen in that older, colder, dark history, didn't start with her. It didn't start with Everett. It went back generations. And somehow, impossibly, it was still happening. She emerged from the tower hours later, soaked through twice over once. By rain once, by grief carrying a steel box heavier than it had any right to be. The storm had passed. The sky over Hollow's Bend had gone the flat gray of early evening, and for one long moment walking down that ridge with the tower behind her, she let herself believe the worst part was over. She was wrong. Two men were waiting at the base of the trail. Suits, clean out of place against the mud and pine needles like they'd been dropped there from somewhere else entirely. Marlowe stopped walking. Every muscle in her body went taut. Miss Whitfield, the taller one said her name like he already owned it. Mr. Thorne would like a word. Her stomach dropped straight through the forest floor. I don't know a Mr. Thorne. You will. He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere close to his eyes. That's your grandfather's land you're standing on. Mr. Thorne's had an interest in this ridge for a long time. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale. The second man spoke for the first time, voice flat, almost bored. Questions just the price. Marlowe's grip tightened on the strap of her bag, on the box inside it, on everything Everett had died protecting. Tell your Mr. Thorne, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, that I'm not interested. The taller man tilted his head, studying her the way you'd study something you already knew you were going to win. Little late for that, sweetheart. He glanced up the ridge toward the tower, barely visible through the trees. Your grandfather made the same mistake, thought he could just say no and walk away. What happened to him wasn't an accident, was it? The question came out before she could stop it. Silence, just long enough to be its own answer. Have a good evening, Miss Whitfield, the man said instead, and the two of them turned and walked back toward a car she hadn't even noticed idling at the edge of the tree line. She stood there long after they'd gone, rain starting again soft this time, almost gentle. Because that wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was worse than a threat. It was a preview. She called Hensley from the burner phone the second she reached cell signal in town, standing under the awning of the diner, rain dripping off the edge above her head. Miss Whitfield. His voice was tight, careful. I take it you found something. I found a lot of somethings. She kept her voice low. And two men who work for someone named Thorne just met me at the bottom of a mountain. Silence on the line, longer than she liked. Say that again, Hensley said. Marcus Thorne. Does that name mean anything to you? The pause this time was even longer, and when Hensley finally spoke, something in his voice had changed completely, the polished distance gone, replaced by something raw. It means everything, he said quietly. Marlowe, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. Before I represented your grandfather, before any of that, I did legal work for Thorne Development, early in my career. I didn't know, not at first, what kind of company it was. Her whole body went still. You worked for him. For 2 years, until I saw what he did to families who wouldn't sell. Until I saw what he did to your grandfather when Everett tried to expose him. Hensley's voice cracked just slightly, just once. I left. I've spent 30 years trying to make up for those 2 years. Representing your grandfather was the only apology I knew how to give him. Marlowe closed her eyes, rain hammering the awning above her. Because everyone in her life, it seemed, was carrying some quiet debt to a dead man. Her grandfather, this lawyer, maybe even the old man at the general store. Everyone except her. She was the one person who never got to know him at all until tonight. He tried to destroy Thorne once, she said. Didn't he? That's what the ledger downstairs is. She heard Hensley go very still on the other end of the line. What ledger? There's more, Walter. There's a whole floor beneath the one Everett built. It goes back further than him, further than any of us. A long breath ragged on the other end. Bring it to me, Hensley said. Tonight, whatever you found, bring it here. Because if Thorne's men already found you, that means he knows the estate's been settled, which means he's moving, which means we don't have as much time as I'd hoped. How much time do we have? Hensley didn't answer right away. I don't know yet, he finally said, but I know Thorne, and I know that man does not send people to greet a grieving 18-year-old out of courtesy. The drive to Hensley's office felt longer than the bus ride north had, because every set of headlights behind her felt like a threat now. Every shadow at the edge of the road felt like it was watching. She kept the steel box on the passenger seat, one hand resting on it at every red light like it might disappear if she stopped touching it. She pulled up outside a small, dark law office on the edge of a town 2 hours from Hollow's Bend, and Hensley opened the door himself before she'd even reached it. He looked older than he had in that mahogany office. Smaller somehow, like the years had finally caught up all at once. "You found the ledger," he said. "Not a question. I found more than one." She set the steel box on his desk, opened it, watched his face as the contents came into the lamplight: stacks of cash, a leather-bound book worn soft at the edges, and beneath it, older still, the second book from the deeper chamber, its cover cracked with age that predated either of them. Hensley's hand hovered over the older book without touching it. "Josiah's," he whispered. "You knew about him too." "I knew there was a first ledger. Everett mentioned it once years ago, late at night, more wine in him than usual. He said his father started something he never got to finish, that Everett had spent his whole life finishing it in secret." Hensley looked up at her and his eyes were wet behind those thick lenses. "I never dreamed you'd be the one to actually find it." Marlowe sat down across from him, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than the last 24 hours. "Walter," she said, "what did Thorne do to my great-grandfather?" Hensley was quiet a long moment. "The same thing he did to your grandfather," he said finally. "Buried him. One generation tried to expose him and paid for it in silence. The next generation tried and paid for it in isolation." He looked at her, and something in his expression turned fierce, protective, older than any professional distance should allow. "I will not let there be a third." Marlowe looked down at the ledgers, at the cash, at the weight of two men's entire lives sitting on a mahogany desk in the shape of paper and ink. "He gave me a choice," she said quietly. "Take the money, disappear, live free. And what are you choosing?" She thought about the men in suits at the base of the ridge, about the flat, bored voice that said everything's for sale, about her grandfather driving away from a 7-year-old girl and not stopping for 100 miles because stopping would have gotten her killed. "I'm choosing to finish what they started," she said. "Both of them." Hensley closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there were tears in the corners and something like relief underneath the fear. "Then we don't have much time," he said, reaching for the phone on his desk. "Because if Thorne already sent men to find you, he's not planning to wait for a fair fight." Outside, the storm had picked up again, rattling the office windows. And somewhere out past the dark tree line, in a house Marlowe had never seen and never wanted to, Marcus Thorne was already making his next move. The call came at 2 in the morning. Marlowe was asleep on Hensley's office couch, the ledgers locked in his safe, her hand still curled like it was holding something even in sleep. The phone rang once, twice. Hensley answered before the third ring finished, and something in his voice, sharp, instant awake, pulled her straight up out of whatever thin sleep she'd managed. "Slow down," he said into the receiver. "Say that again." She was already on her feet. "Walter." He held up a hand, listening, his face going pale in the lamplight, pale in a way that made her chest go tight before he'd said a single word to her. "Someone's at the tower," he finally said, lowering the phone. "The old man from the general store. Says he saw headlights on the Ridge Road an hour ago. Says he heard something metal tearing, he called it. Then smoke." Marlowe's whole body went cold. "They're burning it. They're trying to." Hensley was already grabbing his coat. "Which means they know exactly what's inside. Which means somebody talked. Or somebody watched you longer than we realized. The ledgers are safe. They're in your—" "The ledgers aren't the only thing in that tower, Marlowe." His eyes found hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, Walter Hensley looked genuinely frightened. "Everett kept copies. I know he did. If Thorne's men destroy the tower before the hearing, there's no chain of evidence, no proof of where any of it came from. A ledger with no origin is just a book somebody could have written yesterday." She was already moving toward the door. Marlowe. I'm not losing it, she said. Not after everything it cost to keep it standing this long. The drive back to Hollow's Bend was the fastest 2 hours of her life, because every mile marker felt like it was mocking her. Because the rain had started again, hammering the windshield until the wipers could barely keep pace. And somewhere behind that gray wall of water was a fire that might already be finishing what one phone call couldn't stop. Until the tree line broke and she saw it. Orange light, low against the base of the ridge. Not the whole tower, not yet, but enough. Enough to see shapes moving near the north face. Enough to see the door, her grandfather's door, already forced half open, sparks catching on something inside. She was out of the car before it fully stopped. Marlowe, wait! Hensley's voice somewhere behind her, useless against the wind. She didn't wait. She ran up that ridge the way she'd run from nothing in her entire 18 years, because this was the first thing that had ever actually been hers, and she was not going to watch it burn from a distance. A man in dark clothes turned at the sound of her footsteps, startled, caught. Hey! She didn't stop to explain herself. She grabbed the fire extinguisher, bolted just inside the bunker entrance because, of course, Everett had one, because the man built a shelter meant to survive anything, and would never have forgotten something as basic as fire suppression. And she came at the flames low and fast, sweeping the spray across the base of the fire before it could climb any higher into the old wood shelving. Get back, the man shouted, but she wasn't listening to him anymore. Behind her, headlights swept across the trees. Another car, and out of it the same flat, bored voice from the ridge trail 2 days earlier. This is becoming tiresome, Marcus Thorne said, stepping into the firelight for the first time. He looked exactly like a man who owned half the county's misfortune. Silver hair and overcoat too clean for a mountain in the rain, hands folded like he was watching a mildly interesting problem solve itself. Marlowe stood between him and the smoldering doorway extinguisher, still hissing in her hands. Soot streaked across her face. You, she said. Me. Thorne almost smiled. You have your grandfather's stubbornness. I'll give you that. He also stood exactly where you're standing once, defending a hole in a mountain like it mattered. It mattered enough that you spent 30 years trying to bury it. Something flickered behind his eyes, small, fast, gone before she could name it. Careful, he said quietly. Ledgers can be discredited, buildings can burn, but people, he tilted his head. People are so much easier to make disappear quietly. Ask your grandfather. Oh, wait. A pause, deliberate, cruel. You can't. Something in Marlowe went very still and very cold. Get off my land, she said. Thorne actually laughed, short, genuine, the laugh of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. Your land, he repeated, for now. He turned, walked back toward his car without hurrying, without looking back the way men walk when they've never once had to run from anything in their lives. His men followed. The fire, smaller now, hissed out under the last of her spray in the rain that had never stopped falling. Marlowe stood there, chest heaving, watching taillights disappear down the ridge road. He'd said for now, which meant this wasn't over, which meant tomorrow's hearing wasn't the end of anything. It was the only chance she had left. The courthouse the next morning felt too small for what was about to happen inside it. Marlowe sat in the back row exactly where Hensley had insisted she stay out of sight, out of Thorne's line of vision until the moment it mattered. Her hands were folded so tight in her lap, her knuckles had gone white. Thorne sat at the front, unbothered, expensive, chatting quietly with his lawyers like this was any other Tuesday. Because to him, she realized it was. The judge called the case. Thorne's attorney rose first, smooth rehearsed, presenting a promissory note with Everett's supposed signature, a debt they claimed secured against the land itself, unpaid defaulted grounds for immediate seizure. It looked convincing. That was the terrifying part. It looked exactly official enough to work. Hensley stood. Your Honor, he said, voice steady in a way Marlowe knew had cost him everything to manage. Before we proceed on the note, I'd like to submit evidence regarding the business practices of the plaintiff. He placed the ledgers on the bench, both of them. Josiah's brittle decades-older pages beside Everett's careful coded entries, two generations of the same family quietly documenting the same man's crimes across nearly 90 years. The courtroom went silent in that particular way rooms go silent right before something breaks. The judge read, slowly at first, then faster, his expression shifting from polite skepticism into something colder, sharper. Marlowe watched Thorne's face from the back row, watched the practiced calm slip. Just slightly, just enough. Because he'd known about Everett's ledger. He'd spent decades making sure it never surfaced. But Josiah's the first one, the one buried a full level deeper, hidden by a man dead for over half a century. That one she realized, watching color drain slowly from Thorne's face. That one he'd never even known existed. Two men in dark suits entered from the back of the courtroom. State investigators, quiet, unhurried, exactly the way Hensley had promised they would be. One leaned down and spoke low into Thorne's ear. The color left his face entirely. No shouting, no scene, just the quiet, methodical unraveling of a man who had built his entire life on nobody ever looking closely enough. They let him out through a side door. His expensive coat suddenly looked like something borrowed, something that had never really fit him at all. The case against the estate was dismissed within the hour. The land and everything standing on it was hers, free and clear. The story unspooled through the local paper over the following weeks, and then the regional one. And then, because these things have a way of growing once the first domino falls beyond that entirely. Thorne Development had spent nearly 40 years quietly forcing families off land across 3 counties. Bribery. Fraud. Threats disguised as generous offers nobody was ever really allowed to refuse. Josiah's ledger, decades old, connected the earliest cases. Everett's connected the rest all the way up to the week before he died. Other families came forward. People who'd sold under pressure they never had proof of until now. People who'd lost land, lost homes, lost decades believing it had simply been bad luck instead of a targeted, deliberate campaign. It was, as one reporter put it, an avalanche nobody saw coming, except it had been coming for 90 years. It just needed someone standing at the bottom of a mountain willing to catch it. Marlowe used part of the money to pay Hensley properly, though he tried more than once to refuse it. Let me do this, she told him the day she finally convinced him to take the check. You spent 30 years apologizing to a dead man. Let this be the last payment on that debt. He didn't argue after that. She went back to Hollow's Bend in early spring. Bought an old truck. Cleared brush from the 5 acres slow and steady, letting sunlight reach forest floor that hadn't seen it in years. Found the foundation of a house she barely remembered, and started quietly to imagine building something new on top of what was left of something old. The tower still stood at the edge of the ridge, scorched slightly on one side now, stone and steel, both a little more scarred than before but standing. She didn't hide it anymore. She cleaned out the shelter, aired it top to bottom until the smell of dust and old fear finally gave way to something that just smelled like a room again. She kept the cot, kept the folded blanket, a quiet memorial to a man who'd spent decades alone in the dark, protecting a girl he loved too much to let anyone use against him. And then she did something neither Everett nor Josiah ever could have imagined. She opened the door. Not the steel one on the north face, though. That one too, eventually, but the whole property. She turned the tower into something the families of Hollow's Bend had never had before, a place to gather. A small museum inside the old stone base filled with photographs and letters and the names of every family Thorne had ever tried to erase. The old man from the general store came up the newly cleared track one afternoon, a thermos of coffee in hand. Figured you might be thirsty, he said, handing it over. They stood together looking out at the tower against the spring sky. Your great-grandfather built that thing to watch for something that never came, he said quietly. Turns out he was watching for the wrong thing. The danger wasn't ever out there. He nodded toward the horizon. It was already here, just wearing a nice suit. Just Marlowe wrapped both hands around the warm thermos, watching light catch on rusted steel that no longer looked frightening. Just old. Just honest. I know, she said softly. I finally know. She wasn't a ward of the state anymore. Wasn't a case file, a placement, a name on somebody's overloaded caseload. She was Marlowe Whitfield, granddaughter of a man who drove away from a crying 7-year-old and didn't stop for 100 miles because stopping would have gotten her killed. Great-granddaughter of a man who built a lighthouse for a storm nobody else could see coming and was right about it anyway, just 90 years too early to prove it. Her story wasn't abandonment. It never had been. It was sacrifice wearing a disguise so convincing it had taken her 18 years in one impossible tower to finally see through it. Standing there on land that was finally completely hers, Marlowe understood something that she hadn't been able to name. Back in that mahogany office, back when $1,100 in a worthless piece of land felt like the last insult of a man who never loved her. The past isn't always something to escape. Sometimes it's the only foundation solid enough to build anything real on top of. She looked up at the tower one more time, scarred standing hers, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that wasn't grief. She felt home.